And finally, I said, I'm not me anymore. I'm one with the darkness that's nothing/everything. In that experience, I truly lost my fear of death. I I know what it is for my consciousness to function apart from this identity.
Today we have the privilege of having here with us Dr. Jan Holden. Well, and Jan doesn't really need much of an introduction, as you're currently the president of IANDS. You're also the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed academic Journal of Near-Death Studies, professor emerita of counseling at the University of North Texas, and your primary research focus for a number of decades by now has been counseling implications of near-death experiences, after-death communication, and other transpersonal experiences. So thank you, Jen, for giving me the chance to speak to you today. And I wanted to start this conversation by asking, what brought you to this fascinating field of research?
Well, growing up, I was always interested in things that were mysterious. And I read books about Edgar Casey, who was he'd go into trance and do medical clairvoyance, and books about mysticism and paranormal phenomena and that sort of thing. So when I got a bachelor's degree in psychology in behaviorism, which is just about as far from all that as as anything can be. But I never lost my interest in those things. And during my master's degree, I was in a program that had a couple of faculty members who were involved in transpersonal sorts of things. And I don't know if your listeners know what the word transpersonal refers to, but it refers to any experience that in some way transcends the usual personal limits of space, time, identity, or influence. And so that includes things like near-death experiences, after-death communication, and shared death experiences, paranormal phenomena, just all those kinds of things. And then in 1978, I read Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. And about 7 years later, I was working on my doctoral dissertation. And long story short, I ended up doing my dissertation on something related to near-death experiences. And from that point on, I was just hooked. I just find these experiences endlessly fascinating. And even now, as you know, one of the perks of being an IANDS member is getting the monthly near-death experience in your email box. And whenever that appears in my email box, I almost always drop everything and read it because as many, I've probably read, talked with, interviewed, hundreds of people's near-death experiences. And yet I want to read yet another one because they're also interesting. So, and then, as you know, during near-death experiences, a lot of times people have after-death communication with deceased loved ones. So I really got into that area as well. So the areas I consider myself most expert are NDEs and ADC.
Nice. So I think our audience would benefit by knowing, what do we know so far about what is happening in the brain during a near-death experience?
That's a great question. And my best answer is that I am particularly interested in the phenomenon of veridical perception, where a person during their NDE perceives something that couldn't be known to them through normal means, but they perceive it during the NDE and report it later, and then it's verified as having been accurate. And in many cases, while this is happening, the person is in cardiac arrest. There's no breathing, no circulation of blood to the brain. There's presumably no measurable activity in the brain. And yet the person is uh, very conscious, clear, perceiving very clearly, more clearly than normal, and from a position outside their body and perceiving the environment, um, while their brain seems to be offline. So I think that there actually is a little bit different question, and that is, how can a person have a lucid, vivid experience of perception when their brain appears not to be functioning at all? And so now, certainly, the brain comes into play after the experience when the person lodges the memory, in their brain somehow. Um, but that's what's called the hard question of consciousness: is how does our consciousness relate to the functioning of the brain? And we know that there are correlations, but there's often an assumption that if something correlates with an activity of the brain must have caused it. But actually, it's possible that that the two things happen at the same time, but not because the brain is producing, the um, experience. So, uh, I'm interested in the question of, and I don't have an answer. I only know that there's a really important question about how can people perceive without apparent involvement of the brain.
That makes perfect sense. And as you mentioned, the Veridical cases. In fact, I'm going to do a little plug here because this book, for anyone that hasn't seen it yet, obviously published at
Yeah.
IANDS, I think this is a must-have. There's over 100 cases of veridical, cases that have been verified externally, which obviously, yeah, begs the question. So where does consciousness reside? Is it is it byproduct of the brain, which does not feel anymore? That's the case. So we have to review some of the assumptions that we've kept over the last centuries. And there's obviously shared death experiences, not just the person who's dying, but the people around them, which are, sharing similar elements of an NDE. There's near-death-like experience as well, which I find fascinating, which for those who don't know is when you don't even need an event of clinical death, but people are able to come out of the body even before an impact, before the event of death itself. So yeah, I think you're right. We do still need to ask the hard questions because we haven't quite found a satisfactory answer.
No, that's right. And I think near death experiences are among the most, and especially as you mentioned, all those cases in the self does not die are the strongest evidence that consciousness is not dependent on the brain. And that then brings into play the whole question of the survival, the existence of consciousness prior to physical embodiment, and the survival of consciousness after the physical body's demise. It really points to consciousness being a fundamental, eternal um, feature of the universe. So yeah, so it really gets down to some, probably the most basic questions of existence.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you feel we're getting there? We're getting closer to answering that question. Do you feel that perhaps we are entering perhaps even a new era, a shift from a material to a more spiritual society, and that perhaps has been triggered by the advent of the field of near-death studies and many of the other new fields of science, which are challenging, some of the old assumptions.
Yeah, I do. We're inching toward it, and I do wonder. It seems like some qualitative shift needs to happen where there's widespread acknowledgement that the materialist view that everything is a product of the physical world um, is replaced by a view that consciousness is primary and the physical world is a manifestation of consciousness, and what that means for the meaning and purpose in life. And uh, and I wonder, I a lot of near-death experiencers say that they were shown in their near-death experience that at some point in the future, humanity is going to make this shift, and human life is going to be very different than it is right now because people will know things like that. Even though it feels like we're disconnected, I'm me, you're you, that we're really connected at a very fundamental level, and that whatever I do to you, I actually do to myself, and people will behave very differently from everything from moment to moment interactions all the way up to, global policy and things like that. Um, I, I'm very curious how that shift is going to occur. Uh, I don't think that um, it's going to be the. I really don't know. I can't imagine how that shift can occur. What I do know is that uh, throughout my life, I've had experiences of foreseeing the future, like a future event that from the point of that I have the experience seems like that's impossible that that's going to happen. Like things seem to be going this way, but the vision tells me that they're going to go this way. And what I've learned is just wait, because even though they're going this way, it's going to go like this, and it's going to end up being accurate. And so I believe that that is going to happen someday for humanity. I'm just curious about how that
Mhm.
thing, because it doesn't seem, it seems like we're just kind of inching in that direction right now with things like this book, which a lot of hardcore materialists just dismiss cases, no matter how well documented they are. If it's not captured under controlled circumstances, it doesn't pass scientific muster. And so there's this ongoing tension that's causing this to be an inching process, and but somehow it's going to shift, and I look forward to seeing how that will happen.
Well, you find me very hopeful with what the next decades are going to bring to humanity as well.
Yeah, because NDErs do say that we're in for some really difficult times before that shift happens. It's almost like we have to reach a
The
nadir,
matters point, yeah.
a low point, yeah, before we are motivated enough to make the sacrifices that will be involved in the new worldview.
Yeah.
We won't people who are very powerful will not be that powerful. And so there are sacrifices and concessions that are going to have to be made for us to reach that point. And I think humanity isn't ready for that yet,
Okay. But we're getting closer. That's the
but
feeling
we're
we get.
getting
Yeah.
closer. Yeah,
At least
I
that.
think so. Yeah.
Yes, great. I'm also very interested in your work with counseling for NDErs. So perhaps we could discuss what counselors or therapists may need to be aware of in order to, try and help NDErs integrate their experiences.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Um, I did a study a few years ago asking near death experiencers about their experiences disclosing their near death experience to healthcare providers. And so, uh, most readers, most of your listeners, that is, probably know that in every healthcare profession, there's a fundamental ethic to do no harm. And what I found in this study was that a good proportion, like one fifth of the, I think I had 188 near death experiencers responding to this survey.
Oh, wow.
And about a fifth of them reported that as as a result of their disclosure experience, they felt harmed by the way
Wow.
the healthcare provider responded to them. And what was harmful, they identified what was harmful, and there were four possible things. It could be one or more of these four things. One was that the healthcare provider didn't even recognize that what they were describing was a near death experience. And they were kind of like, what? They were just like, um,
You're hallucinating, or,
yeah.
that's what
Well, that was actually the second one,
okay.
which is that in some way the experience was dismissed. You were hallucinating. It was the effect of drugs. It was oxygen deprivation. So some way of explaining away, like they might recognize it as a near death experience, but then say it's not meaningful. It's insignificant because it's a hallucination. The third thing was that the person was pathologized
Yeah.
for having the experience, like they were diagnosed with a mental disorder. And then the fourth thing was that the person or the experience was demonized, that it was rendered evil or of the devil or something like this. And what's really interesting is that research does not support any of those responses. It supports just the opposite. So, for example, near death experiences, we know that they happen. They're a thing, they have a name, and they deserve to be acknowledged as, to say when somebody reports this, a good response is to say something like, it sounds like you may have had what's called a near death experience. And this is something that happens to about somewhere between 10 and 20% of people who survive a close brush with death. So it's not like super common, but it's not rare either. And it has certain features and certain after effects that research has established. And you might be interested in reading or learning more about them to see whether it seems to you like that fits that label might fit for your experience. So that would be a great response. Um, Secondly, the importance of the experience, that the person be believed that the experience was real. We know that the experience is subjectively real. From books like The Self Does Not Die, we have indications that the experience is objectively real. And so it's a good response from a healthcare provider instead of saying it was a hallucination and, trying to diss it away, is to say, these experiences often are very meaningful to people. And so you may want, and they feel absolutely real. And there's some evidence that they're objectively real. And so you may want to look into them for that reason as well, because it may be a very meaningful, important experience in your life. And then the third one about pathologizing, that we have clear evidence that there's no relationship between NDEs and mental disorder. So a lot of times people feel crazy because our culture doesn't prepare people for experiences of realities beyond this physical reality. So they might feel crazy, but a good healthcare response would be, even though it may feel really strange to you, something that you weren't ever prepared or knew that happened, there's very clear evidence there's no relationship between these experiences and mental disorders. So any challenge you're having, trying to integrate the experience or make sense of it is just a normal thing that happens a lot for a lot of people after this experience. It doesn't indicate mental disorder. And then the demonizing thing, again, these experiences, research shows them to be psychospiritually beneficial. People become more empathic, more
Altruistic.
caring,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, less materialistic, more concerned about the well-being of people and the planet and all that kind of stuff. So it's just the opposite of something that deserves to be demonized. So those are the things that sometimes get in the way, and that research has a response of how a healthcare provider can respond in a way that's genuinely helpful to the experiencer.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Jen. So I wonder, what could the IANDS do to perhaps help the healthcare system to create the right support network for NDErs?
Yeah, that's a great question, Danny. One thing we do is we have a page on our website that's for healthcare providers that gives them some of the information I just talked about and some other resources to help educate them because we believe that one of my doctoral students did a study assessing knowledge and attitudes about near death experiences before and after an uh, education about near death experiences,
Oh,
and
interesting.
found, not surprisingly, that this very relatively brief educational information significantly improved people's knowledge and attitudes. So we know that if people are just knowledgeable about near death experiences, they're much more likely to respond helpfully to someone. So we have this educational information on the website. We also have a listing of mental health professionals, licensed mental health professionals in the US who have uh, had some fairly extensive education about transpersonal phenomena, who somebody who's had a near death experience or another transpersonal experience and wants to talk about it with somebody who's really knowledgeable and potentially going to be helpful and not harmful, they can go to the IANDS website and find the listing and see if there's someone in their state who is available to work with them. And the reason I mention state is because in the US, mental health providers are usually licensed to provide their mental health services only in the state where they're licensed.
Okay.
So you have to find somebody in your own state. But a lot of these people are available via Zoom. So even if there's nobody physically located near you, if they're located somewhere in your state, you can do telehealth and do Zoom counseling sessions. So we're in the process of expanding that. And if any of your listeners are licensed mental health professionals who have had some extensive, like taken a course, or if they happen to be an certified by the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. It's quite a
That's a
mouthful.
mouthful.
They would qualify to be added to this list, and they can go to the IANDS website and find their way to how to apply to be included in the list. So those are a couple of ways. And we also, do right now. The IANDS Mental Health Committee is exploring uh, a continuing education course that we might be offering for continuing education. So, but that'll be probably a year or so from now before that happens.
Yeah, these things take time. Absolutely. So, well, we often talk about the after effects in NDErs, but I feel that, and obviously these are very well documented by now, I don't feel we're talking enough about the after effects on those that may have not had a direct experience, but perhaps have studied these topics long enough, like yourself and I. So, if I understand correctly, you're not an experiencer. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, well, this is a little tricky because I have not had a near death experience per se, but I've had a lot of transpersonal experiences, including in some ketamine assisted therapy. I had a couple of experiences that score like a near death experience on the NDE scale. So, but I've never been physically close to death. But as we know, you don't have to be
Yeah.
to have a near death like experience that's indistinguishable from an NDE during a close brush with death and indistinguishable in terms of its after effects. So,
Sure.
so I'm not a technically an experiencer, but still kind of an
There you are
experiencer.
a bit. Okay. That's
Yeah.
great. Well, that's obviously, I'm curious to know how all this research has affected the way you look at life. So, I mean, the first question I tend to ask, my guests is, so whether you were afraid of death before all this research, and if perhaps this has changed in any way for you.
This you're asking such an interesting question right now because, I did this ketamine thing about a year and a half ago.
Oh,
And
okay.
so for decades, I'd been reading about how near-death experiencers lose their fear of death because now they know that their consciousness is going to continue even after their body is out of commission. And I really got that. And I completely understood that. It made perfect sense to me. And I really thought that I had like integrated that information. But in in one of my ketamine experiences, if you don't mind my taking a minute to explain what
Yeah,
happened,
please, please.
um, I I found I found myself and my that is my consciousness uh, in space, perched outside of darkness. Like I'm here and darkness is there. And that's what I said to my therapist because when this is happening with ketamine, you've got blinders on and
Okay.
ketamine is IV, and so, but you're conscious and you can talk. And so I said I'm perched outside of darkness, and I've just felt like fine, like I'm here, darkness is there. There was nothing scary or anything. It was what it was. Then I started to go into the darkness, and I said I'm entering the darkness. And then I said to her several times, I'm losing my sense of myself. I'm losing my sense of myself. And finally I said, I'm not me anymore. I'm one with the darkness that's nothing/everything.
Oh, wow.
And in that experience, I was completely conscious. I was what I now understand to be there's a term in esoteric stuff called the pregnant void, and it's the precursor to all phenomena. It's the source. It's the source of everything before anything manifests as a thing.
Yeah.
And that's where I was, and I was one with it. And even to use the word I, it's not quite right, because my consciousness was diffused and unified with everything prior to anything being anything. And I even at one point, it was an all encompassing experience that just kind of was an experience of absolute being. And I was completely content. I wasn't like elated or anything like that. I was just completely content and um, just in a state of absolute equanimity. But I did at one point have this vague thought like, how, if I had to put words to it, but I wasn't thinking in words at the time, it was, how did I get here? And I tried to remember, and I couldn't. I
Yeah.
couldn't remember. I couldn't remember that I'm Jan, that I was getting ketamine, that I had no memory of my identity as Jan. And so then, the ketamine is reduced. I come back to normal consciousness, and I'm reflecting on this, and I realized that in that experience, I truly lost my fear of death.
Oh,
I know what it is for my consciousness to function apart from this identity. And what I realized is that all those years that I'd been reading about near death experiencers losing their fear of death, I still retained what was unconscious until the ketamine experience, a fear like, how could I possibly be if I'm not me? How could I possibly be if I'm not Jan? And this ketamine experience, I experienced it. So so what I would say is that I know research shows that reading about NDEs, learning about them, reduces people's fear of death. It does. And in my experience, there was nothing, no amount of that could equal the experience of actually being without identity. And so, um, so I stopped short of recommending that everybody do ketamine, and certainly I did it under very
Controlled.
specific
Yeah, of
circumstances.
course.
Yeah, I've really wanted to do psychedelics ever since college, and I'm 75 now. So it wasn't until I learned about this therapist in Texas who was doing ketamine, IV ketamine. I met her. I knew immediately that she was wonderful. And so that's the only psychedelic experience I've ever had is under these very controlled circumstances. So I highly recommend if somebody's going to do it, they do it that way,
Yeah.
because having somebody who's knowledgeable, not only knowledgeable about the drugs, but transpersonally knowledgeable to process the experience and everything, it's vital to the experience, having it's the full effect that it can have.
Well, hi there. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of the interview. The full episode can be viewed on our YouTube membership program, which we are launching on January 1st, 2026. So stay tuned and join us then for the rest of the conversation and many more exclusive interviews with some of the biggest names in the field of near-death studies and beyond. Bye for now.